everybody. My name is Colin McGill. I'm the project director for Net Zero Teesside. So I'd like to share with you this afternoon some ideas about how we can actually implement the world's first decarbonised industrial cluster. So first of all, the Net Zero Teesside, the most critical thing about this is that first of all, everybody agrees that carbon capture and storage is required to meet climate targets. So the IPC, for example, estimates that between 5 and 10 billion tonnes a year is required to reach the Paris goal. And in the UK, the CCC has suggested that somewhere between 75 and 150 million tonnes of carbon will need to be injected every year, which is roughly half the UK's current emissions. The most important product from Net Zero Teesside will not be the project itself, it'll actually be the business models that underpin the ability to decarbonise industry. Most previous attempts at CCUS have failed because of lack of government support, not because of the technology, not because of the willingness of the companies involved, but because there's no actual model to allow this to work economically. If we get those business models in place, that allows CCUS to be applied at scale, not just in the UK, but other countries. So the UK, by leading the way in last year and putting in place plans to decarbonise 50%, to decarbonise the UK by 2050, that led to 50% of the world's GDP having plans to be net zero by 2050. And a couple of weeks ago, you saw China have plans to be net zero by 2060. So that leadership that the UK showed there has been incredibly useful. The UK has a history, however, of exporting not just its ideas, but also its regulations. So contract for difference that's been used to price offshore wind, that same model has been very useful and can be applied elsewhere in the UK and around the world if we've got that to be successful. So as I was saying, carbon capture is critical to climate change. It's critical for the UK and it's critical for the world. And the most important thing is to put a business model in place behind that allows you to decarbonise not just in the UK, but also in the rest of the world. As I mentioned, the UK has got a proud tradition of exporting its regulatory setup. So contract for difference has been used in other jurisdictions around the world. And when I've spoken about this in other jurisdictions, pretty much every time somebody from the local government has come to me and asked me how it's being implemented in the UK, because they're very interested in implementing the same sorts of business models in their countries. If you go to the next slide, please. Okay. So this slide here is taken from the Committee on Climate Change's report this time last year. And it's the table on the left is taken directly from the report, and it shows directly what they're anticipating for that system in 2050. And the first thing is that electricity demand doubles over that period. And essentially, it's a swap from hydrocarbon energy, from oil and gas, to electrical. So a lot of home heating is done by electrical, as well as also demand for electric vehicles. That's largely provided for by renewables, but not entirely. So the hydrogen use is also significantly increased. So there's reduced hydrocarbon demand generally. Oil demand is virtually zero at that point, and gas demand is about 3/4 of today's demand, and that's partly used for gas-fired power generation, which is a backup. Thank you. Which is a backup to wind. So it's not windy. You need a backup, and that's where gas-fired power generation works. Also some hydrogen generation, and also heating in industry. And as you'll also see, there's a significant demand for carbon capture in this energy system. And it's about roughly equivalent to today's gas demand in the UK. So a very significant demand there. but it's well within the ability of the offshore oil and gas industry to deliver that amount of carbon capture and storage. It's well within the capabilities. It's not by any means a stretch to do that. If you go to the next slide, please. The conditions in the UK today are very positive for CCUS. So first of all, obviously, as we've talked about already, the UK is committed to achieve net zero by 2050. In the budget in March this year, there was at least 800 million included in the budget for CCUS projects. And it also specifically mentioned support for a gas-fired power station supported by consumer subsidies. And that's effectively the NZT project. There isn't really any other project at the moment which is looking at this. Perhaps more importantly, however, NZT and the other projects that are looking at carbon capture and storage in the UK directly support the levelling up agenda of the UK government. They're all in areas that the UK government would like to address for that. And a couple of, and several times since the pandemic, people have asked about the government's desire to continue to spend money on CCUS. And if anything, it's increased its desire, not on CCS specifically, but it's this desire to invest in green infrastructure projects is really significant, and CCUS projects can play a big part in that going forward. So if you go to the next slide, please. I think it's now time for the video. Oh, there's one more. Sorry. Just to let you know a little bit about the other CCUS opportunities in the UK. There's the Acorn project in Scotland, which is essentially a small. The idea is to capture hydrogen, CO2 from hydrogen project there using existing infrastructure. You've got the Humber, which is the biggest UK emissions from industry. That's obviously just south of Net Zero Teesside, and we've got a link up there, which we'll talk about later. You've got the HyNet project in the west of the country, which is looking at capturing CO2 from hydrogen and industry. And then you've got South Wales, which is focused on capturing CO2 from steel. And the main issue with that project is that there's nowhere locally in Wales to actually store the CO2. So it's going to require at least one of the other projects to go ahead, and then it's going to have to find a way to ship the CO2 to that. But those are the 5 projects which are currently being looked at in the UK. So I'm going to spend the rest of the talk, however, talking about Net Zero Teesside and its characteristics. So if you go on to the next slide, please, which I think now is the time for the video. If you can share that, please.
Teesside's industrial heritage goes back not just decades, but centuries to iron making and steel making, and more recently as Europe's first integrated modern chemical plant. We are the second largest carbon emitting region in the country, and that means unless we reduce our carbon footprint in a measured and sensible way, we could see the loss of many, many hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs.
Net Zero Teesside will be the world's first industrial decarbonised cluster. The aim is to take CO2 from a range of industries in Teesside, take it to a central gathering point, compress it, send it offshore, and store it safely in an underground reservoir in the North Sea.
It's an opportunity to offset a huge amount of carbon dioxide production, equivalent to 2 million homes a year's worth of carbon production, and will potentially store up to 6 million tonnes per annum of carbon dioxide. In addition, we're going to build a new gas-fired power station, and we'll capture the carbon dioxide that produces as well and store that. The combination of these two things will allow us to capture future carbon dioxide from new industries brought into the region and allow all of this combined to decarbonise the whole of the area.
So I think that's one of the exciting things of Teesside Net Zero Initiative, in that it will supply that infrastructure to enable companies to capture their carbon and comply with the new regulations.
Being a part of the Net Zero Teesside project, to me, means being part of the solution towards climate change, particularly industrial decarbonisation and also decarbonised power.
The consultation process as part of the development consent order requires us to hold a stage 1 consultation event, which we held back in October 2019. This gave the community and local stakeholders the opportunity to raise any concerns or challenges that they have with the project moving forward.
Teesside is a fantastic place to decarbonise the industry. It's relatively compact, it's near a range of offshore stores. In addition to that, there's a very proud industrial heritage in Teesside, and it would be great to revitalise the economy here by taking it back to where the industry first started and learning how to do low carbon industry.
As part of the development order submission, we need to also have a stage 2 consultation. This is giving us the opportunity to show how we've incorporated comments from the local communities and engage with them further with the increase in design definition that we now have.
What better place to invest in a first-of-a-kind carbon capture, use and storage project?
The Net Zero Teesside project will bring tremendous opportunities to Sembcorp and Teesside. The existing customer base and manufacturers on Teesside will benefit from it, but so will companies looking to develop new manufacturing assets in the UK. They will have a place where they can come and get large volume energy at low or zero carbon.
CCUS is vitally important to the world. Every major study has concluded it's impossible to meet the world's carbon targets without carbon capture and storage.
The Net Zero Teesside project will impact the UK because it's the first-of-a-kind industrial cluster. The first time anywhere on the globe that we'll be able to say we have a zero carbon production industrial cluster. And that provides a great opportunity to export those skills and capabilities developed here locally on Teesside all around the country and hopefully the world.
To make Teesside the centre of a world-leading project like this would mean it would create new jobs, it would protect existing jobs, and it would create a platform for new and innovative technologies in the 21st century not seen in this area for many decades.
Thank you. If you can bring the presentation back now, please. Thanks very much. If you can go on to the go on 2 slides, please. Thanks very much indeed. So you heard a lot of the reasons about why we chose Teesside for this opportunity. You know, it's a compact site, which means it's very cost effective to gather the CO2. It's only about 10 kilometres in diameter. And there's a range of very interesting industries there in Teesside. We've got hydrogen producer and an ammonium producer, which produce very high concentrations of CO2 in their flue streams, which make it very cost effective to gather. So we've got some very cost effective CO2 sources. What's also interesting, though, is if you look at the total CO2 emitted from Teesside, there is about 3 million tonnes of CO2 that's reported to the EU trading scheme that people have to pay carbon tax on. But there's also a further 3 million tonnes of non-recordable CO2 emissions, which come from renewable sources, so like bioenergy and energy from waste plants. And by capturing that, that's what allows you effectively to get to negative emissions in Teesside, be able to do that. And not only if we do that, and if we capture CO2 from that, not only can we get to net zero in Teesside, but we can actually generate negative carbon electricity. Finally, there is a little bit of spare capacity in the hydrogen plant in Billingham. And because it's part of an old ICI site, it's actually possible to distribute the hydrogen around the chemical site there. So it's the most cost-effective way of trying out fuel switching in industries as well. And underneath that, it's going to be supported by a dispatchable power station. And there are two reasons for that. The first is it's actually needed by the UK's energy system, and I'll talk about that more shortly. But perhaps as importantly, you can get a long-term contract for a power station, and that underpins investment in the infrastructure required to decarbonise, which may be harder to get if you're basing it just on industrial decarbonisation. So, for example, INEOS, which was one of the biggest emitters in the area, emitted about 500,000 tonnes a year, has recently closed. And so if you're basing your investment just on that, it makes it quite difficult. Having something you know is going to be there for the long term makes it easier to invest in. And perhaps most important factor of all, however, is the very strong local political industrial support. We've talked about the companies that are keen to decarbonise in the region already, but also it's under one unified area. It's under one mayor, and that makes a big difference. If you compare it to something like Humberside, for example, which comes under 3 regional authorities, each with their own agendas and their own priorities, it makes it much harder to actually to create a unified view of what's actually going to happen. So lots of reasons why it's a great site to do it on. You go on to the next slide, please. So this is a slide discussing why we need power in the UK. So why we need low carbon power in the UK. So this is a model we've had done by a company called Baringa. And what we asked them to do was to look at the carbon intensity of the grid. So the black line shows the amount of CO2 per kilowatt hour produced on the grid. And initially, up until about 2030, Baringa's got views of which sort of offshore wind plants and other things are going to come onto the system. But beyond 2030, we don't have any firm plans. So what we asked them to do is to just say, okay, let's just assume that the carbon intensity declines linearly over time and ends up at 0 in 2050. And then we've asked them to do so, with those assumptions, what gives you the power market with the lowest cost? And what it shows is that there's a big increase in offshore wind, which is shown by the green, which is what you'd expect. But what you can also see is that there is some offshore gas, which is in the sort of second from the bottom. There's some gas-fired power stations without CCUS, and they're gradually replaced over time by gas-fired power stations with CCS. And the reason that they're important is because it's not always windy. You can have wind periods of up to 4 or 5 days at a time. And if you look at how much it would cost to build a battery, for example, to provide that backup power, it would be around £1 trillion. It'd be hugely expensive to do it in terms of batteries. They're not really designed, at least not yet anyway, they're not really suitable for long-term storage of power. And so this actually provides a backup to wind. And the only real choice at the moment is between nuclear and a gas-fired power station with CCS. And at the moment, it's much cheaper to have a gas-fired power station with CCS. And part of the reason for that is that most of the cost of a nuclear power station is in the construction. If you're only running it for half the time, that effectively doubles the cost of power that's generated by a nuclear power station. With a gas-fired power station, about 80% of the cost is actually in the fuel itself. So if you're only burning it for half the time, it doesn't put up the cost of the power nearly so much. And so it's always more cost-effective to provide backup power supplies, at least at the moment, with carbon capture and storage. Later on in time, beyond about 2040, you can see a sort of light blue slither in there. And what happens there is that you get hydrogen being used. So at the moment, we've got a whole bunch of peaking plants, which are designed to provide power in the event of a real demand on the power system. Eventually, they're only used for maybe a few hours a year. And ultimately, if you really want to drive down the intensity of the grid, you can no longer burn them on gas, and so you have to burn them on hydrogen. So that's the pattern we see. And no matter how we change the costs, you always end up with that sort of same basic pattern happening in the power market going forward. If you can go on to the next project, please. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier the tie-up with Humber. So there was a big offshore store called Endurance, and there was another series of offshore stores beyond that. And so we are about to launch the Northern Endurance Partnership, and that will be an offshore gathering system which will take CO2 from Teesside and Humberside and store it initially in Endurance, and then as demand grows, it will expand to other potential sites that we've already identified for future expansion. So that makes it very attractive to do this, because it obviously lowers the cost for capturing CO2 from both Teesside and from Humberside. Thanks very much. You can move on to the next one. So, of course, by building these plants, we can have huge impact on both the local and the national economy. So just Net Zero Teesside by itself could support something like £400 million a year and about sort of 5,000 jobs between the period of 2024 to 2028, just in direct jobs in the area. Obviously, many more indirect jobs as well. But if by deploying Net Zero Teesside, that unlocks CCS developments across the world, by 2030, that will support something like 1.6 billion of added value every year and 18,000 jobs. And if we go further than that, if we can actually take advantage of the first mover advantage that gives to the UK, so that we can expertise, skills and services, we can unlock a further £1 billion a year and a further 13,000 jobs annually by 2040. So potentially huge opportunities for CCS in the area. And if you go to the next slide, please, I think that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much. That's great. So thank you very much. I see that there's some questions. So there's a comment from Andrew Stogdale about should we raise the aspiration of awareness of young people? Yeah, agree fully with that. We need to do that and get them interested and excited in the project going forward. There's a question from Michael Spain. He says, with global CO2 levels still rising, how long will it be before we can turn things around, and will the UK's efforts make that much difference to the global picture? So the answer is that the UK's efforts are very important. Although we only emit a couple of % of the CO2 in the world, nevertheless, our leadership has been vital here. You saw last year, after the UK committed to decarbonise by 2050, as I mentioned earlier, 50% of the world's GDP has now committed to becoming net zero by 2050 as a direct result of following Britain's leadership on that. So I think that actually, although our CO2 may not that much difference, only a relatively small amount, our leadership in this area will ensure that others will follow and that others will also decarbonise. So it makes a huge effort to do something here. It makes a huge difference to how we can do this. And if you look at how quickly we can do this, it's largely going to depend on government policies. Governments have to put in policies like the fact to bring forward the fact that they don't want internal combustion engines sold. They have to bring that end date forward earlier. They have to put in place policies which will allow you to decarbonise industry effectively. They need to put in policies in place to allow sort of gradual expansion of offshore wind, or rapid expansion of offshore wind. So yes, it's absolutely vital, and we can make a huge difference here. There's a question about how much storage capacity there is in the system. So there's a lot of storage capacity in the system. If you look at the UK has done an assessment read by the British Geological Society, and that's estimated there is something like 5 trillion tonnes of storage capacity available in the North Sea alone. So yes, there's a lot of storage capacity out there in the UK and also the rest of the world. It depends on where you are. You have to have the right geology, but yes, there's a huge amount of geology that's out there and possible. Becca Dodds has asked about how do you find out business opportunities and supply chain requirements. We're still working on our contracting strategy. However, we are, if you look at the Net Zero Teesside website, as a supplier, you can register your interest there. The schedule going forward here is that we hope to enter FEED in the middle of next year, and start execution sometime early 2023. So for many of you, most of the contracts will actually be in place in that sort of 2023 period. But please do go onto the website and register your interests. That would be fantastic. And Carl has asked the same question. Just see if I can. So I can, apologies, I can only see, it says I've got 7 questions here, but I can only see 4 of them. Is there a way to bring those up? No, hold on. Laura asked a question, Laura Hepburn asked a question. Hydrogen would be fantastic, but we don't have the infrastructure till a long time down the line here in Tees Valley. Do you agree that we need to scrutinise businesses and encourage their practices to be responsible in their own business models right now to be more sustainable and carbon aware? We also need to work in tandem with Tees Valley businesses that are innovative to make this work successfully. We make this a priority. Absolutely, Laura. I think there are a number of things that have to happen here for this to happen. As I mentioned, I think a lot of industry can actually do hydrogen relatively quickly in Teesside because it's got a distribution system of hydrogen, which is one of the hardest things to do. So once that's in place, we just need the hydrogen supply, and it's possible to get hydrogen around the industries reasonably quickly. But in order to make that happen, there has to be policies in place from government which actually allow that to happen effectively. That's kind of one thing. In the meantime, absolutely, every business should be looking to do what they can to minimise the CO2 of what they can produce. And I think also as consumers, we have a role here. If we start to demand low carbon products, then that's going to be something that companies will start to supply. At the moment, there is no premium for making a low carbon product, which makes it hard for manufacturers to invest in additional expenditure to make low carbon products. If we start as consumers to demand that, then that will change, and that will also help accelerate this practice. So Julie Harrison asks, can we include nature in any future building construction work? Absolutely. We're looking at that as we design the project, and we're thinking about how we can do that going forward. Dave Armstrong asked, how can this be dovetailed into other major projects to ensure that the peaks and troughs of major projects award does not lead to opportunities going outside the northeast because of capacity constraints? I think that would be a nice problem to have. At the moment, we are working very closely with the government to try and get something working, get one of these projects working. If we get to the stage of having multiple ones, that would be even better. And I fully agree that if we can avoid peaks and troughs, that would be a fantastic thing. Julie Harrison asked, shouldn't we be moving away from gas and looking at other ways of reducing CO production in all industries? Yes, we should be moving away from unabated gas at the very least. What you do then to replace that depends somewhat on the price of things. So at the moment, for example, if you wanted to make green hydrogen from wind, that costs 4 times as much as buying methane and burning methane. So again, you need industry's policies in place to make that happen. If you make blue hydrogen, it costs about twice as much as that. So we need both of those things to happen. We need we need blue hydrogen probably initially to kick off the hydrogen economy, and then we need green hydrogen, and we need the price to come down from wind, and we need the price from down to come up to electrolyzers, and then it will become, with green hydrogen becomes cheaper than blue hydrogen. But that will probably take a while to happen. Okay, so Michael James has asked about small and micro businesses get involved in the supply chain. As I've mentioned, the best thing to do is to register your interest on the Net Zero Teesside website. That would be great if you can. Simon Bradshaw asked what work is being done to look at utilising the CO2 captured to make valuable chemicals that just storing underground. There is a lot of work going on that, Simon, but at the moment there is no really viable way to use large amounts of CO2. There are some innovative work that's been going on. So, for example, there is a cement company called Solidia that stores CO2 in cement, but it's a relatively small amount of CO2 that's stored there. At the moment, there isn't anything that's actually available which stores CO2 in large quantities, but people are working on it. But at the moment, there isn't anything. So I'm sure that things will change there. But at the moment, they're all relatively small scale. And so carbon capture and storage is the prevalent mechanism at the moment, but that may change as people invent other clever ways for utilization. To minimise the CO2 of what they can produce, and I think also as consumers we have a role here. If we start to demand low carbon products, then that's going to be something that companies will start to supply. At the moment, there is no premium for making a low carbon product, which makes it hard for manufacturers to invest additional expenditure to make low carbon products. If we start as consumers to demand that, then that will change, and that will also help accelerate this practice. So Julie Harrison asks, can we include nature in any future building construction work? Absolutely. We're looking at that as we design the project, and we're thinking about how we can do that going forward. Dave Armstrong asked, how can this be dovetailed into other major projects to ensure that the peaks and troughs of major projects award does not lead to opportunities going outside the northeast because of capacity constraints? I think that would be a nice problem to have. At the moment, we are working very closely with the government to try and get something working, get one of these projects working. If we get to the stage of having multiple ones, that would be even better. And I fully agree that if we can avoid peaks and troughs, that would be a fantastic thing. Julie Harrison asked, shouldn't we be moving away from gas and looking at other ways of reducing CO production in all industries? Yes, we should be moving away from unabated gas at the very least. What you do then to replace that depends somewhat on the price of things. So at the moment, for example, if you wanted to make green hydrogen from wind, that costs 4 times as much as buying methane and burning methane. So again, you need industry's policies in place to make that happen. If you make blue hydrogen, it costs about twice as much as that. So we need both of those things to happen. We need blue hydrogen probably initially to kick off the hydrogen economy, and then we need green hydrogen, and we need the price to come down from wind, and we need the price from down to come up to electrolyzers, and then it will become the green hydrogen becomes cheaper than blue hydrogen. But that will probably take a while to happen. Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much. I hope that's been useful. We've got time for one last question, maybe, and we've got 36 seconds left. In that case, thank you all very much for listening, and I hope you found the presentation interesting. Thank you.
You can be free to do that if you want. Hi, Colin. If you want to answer those questions, the session will go on for a little bit longer after the end time if you want to pick those up.
I think I've answered it, haven't I?
There's 2 more in the Q&A there. I'm just trying to bring them up.
Okay, so Michael James has asked about small and micro businesses get involved in the supply chain. As I've mentioned, the best thing to do is to register your interest on the Net Zero Teesside website. That would be great if you can. Simon Bradshaw asked what work is being done to look at utilising the CO2 captured to make valuable chemicals of just storing underground. There is a lot of work going on that, Simon, but at the moment there is no really viable way to use large amounts of CO2. There are some innovative work that's been going on. So, for example, there is a cement company called Solidia that stores CO2 in cement, but it's a relatively small amount of CO2 that's stored there. At the moment, there isn't anything that's actually available which stores CO2 in large quantities, but people are working on it. But at the moment, there isn't anything. So I'm sure that things will change there. But at the moment, they're all relatively small scale. And so carbon capture and storage is the prevalent mechanism at the moment, but that may change as people invent other clever ways for utilisation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Colin. That was a great chat, and sorry about the technical issues to begin with, but we got there in the end. I think that was very got a lot of Q&As and a lot of interaction from the delegates there. So we're going to end this session now. If everyone wants to make their way back to the timeline, we're going to have the exhibition and the networking open for the next 20 minutes or so you can get some last minute contacts in before a nice well-earned lunch. So thank you very much, Colin. Cheers, bye now.
Thank you.